I never imagined the first betrayal would be so quiet. It wasn't a slammed door or a raised voice. No, my exile arrived in the form of silence. A silence that wrapped itself around me like a velvet rope and gently pulled me out of the frame. It began one Sunday afternoon, the kind with soft light pouring through the curtains and the smell of rosemary and garlic wafting from the oven. I had made my grandson's favorite, lemon chicken with roasted vegetables. The kind of meal that tells you you're safe, loved, remembered. My hands moved automatically in the kitchen, tracing familiar rhythms. The slow wash of carrots under warm water. The slicing of lemons, precise and thin. The way my husband used to like them before he passed. I set the table for 5, even though they often texted to say they'd be late, or wouldn't come at all. But this time there was no text. Just a long, slow nothing. Called once. Straight to voicemail. Again and then again. The clock ticked past 4, then 5, and still no sign of them. The chicken dried out in the oven. The lemon slices darkened around the edges. I sat by the window, fingers tracing the porcelain edge of a teacup, watching the driveway remain empty. When the phone finally rang, it was a message. Not a voice. Just words on a screen. "Sorry, Mom. We made last-minute plans with Emily's family. Hope you understand." Understand. I stared at the message as if it might rearrange itself into something more tender, more human. But it didn't. I didn't respond. What was there to say? That the table was already set. That I'd been counting the hours like a child waiting for summer. That I had ironed the cloth napkins Emily once said made things feel old-fashioned but sweet. I didn't say any of it. Instead, I stood slowly and began clearing the table. One plate at a time. My fingers didn't shake. Not then. Not yet. I wrapped the chicken, put the vegetables in the fridge, and finally slid the lemon slices into the trash. As I wiped down the counter, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something quieter. An awareness. A flickering thought that maybe I was being gently removed. Not violently. Not cruelly. Later that night, I stood at the sink and stared into the dark window. My reflection looked tired. Not sad. Just used up. Like the lemon slices I had tossed out hours earlier. Once bright, now shriveled and unnecessary. And that's when the silence around me began to speak. Said, "Pay attention." It said, "This is only the beginning." And I listened. I never imagined the first betrayal would be so quiet. It wasn't a slammed door or a raised voice. No, my exile arrived in the form of silence. A silence that wrapped itself around me like a velvet rope and gently pulled me out of the frame. It began one Sunday afternoon, the kind with soft light pouring through the curtains and the smell of rosemary and garlic wafting from the oven. I had made my grandson's favorite, lemon chicken with roasted vegetables. The kind of meal that tells you you're safe, loved, remembered. My hands moved automatically in the kitchen, tracing familiar rhythms. The slow wash of carrots under warm water. The slicing of lemons, precise and thin. The way my husband used to like them before he passed. I set the table for 5, even though they often texted to say they'd be late, or wouldn't come at all. But this time there was no text. Just a long, slow nothing. Called once. Straight to voicemail. Again and then again. The clock ticked past 4, then 5, and still no sign of them. The chicken dried out in the oven. The lemon slices darkened around the edges. I sat by the window, fingers tracing the porcelain edge of a teacup, watching the driveway remain empty. When the phone finally rang, it was a message. Not a voice. Just words on a screen. "Sorry, Mom. We made last-minute plans with Emily's family. Hope you understand." Understand. I stared at the message as if it might rearrange itself into something more tender, more human. But it didn't. I didn't respond. What was there to say? That the table was already set. That I'd been counting the hours like a child waiting for summer. That I had ironed the cloth napkins Emily once said made things feel old-fashioned but sweet. I didn't say any of it. Instead, I stood slowly and began clearing the table, one plate at a time. My fingers didn't shake. Not then. Not yet. I wrapped the chicken, put the vegetables in the fridge, and finally slid the lemon slices into the trash. As I wiped down the counter, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something quieter. An awareness. A flickering thought that maybe I was being gently removed. Not violently. Not cruelly. Later that night, I stood at the sink and stared into the dark window. My reflection looked tired. Not sad. Just used up. Like the lemon slices I had tossed out hours earlier. Once bright, now shriveled and unnecessary. And that's when the silence around me began to speak. Said, "Pay attention." It said, "This is only the beginning." And I listened. Started with a drawer. The third one in the kitchen, the one that always stuck halfway, the one my husband had promised to fix but never did. It was where I kept the things that didn't belong anywhere else. Old receipts, dull pencils, coupons for stores that no longer existed, a key to something I could no longer remember. That morning I opened it. Not looking for anything in particular, just looking. I stood in the kitchen with my tea cooling behind me and sifted through fragments of a life that had once felt full. At the back of the drawer, beneath a faded pamphlet from our honeymoon cabin and a postcard from my sister in Vermont, I found a folder. It was blue with the corners softened from time. Inside, property documents, mortgage records, insurance statements, old letters from the city about permits and assessments. My husband's neat, looping signature next to mine on every page. And there, in one particular letter I saw it, a clause about ownership transfer. It was nothing I hadn't read before. Nothing unusual. But that morning it looked different. The way things do when your eyes have finally adjusted to the light. It struck me, not like a revelation but like a quiet tap on the shoulder, that the house was still mine. Fully, legally, silently mine. Despite the suggestions my son had made about transitioning ownership. Despite Emily's passing comments about how they were practically managing everything anyway. No signatures had been added. No transfers filed. They had spoken of the house as if it already belonged to them. Planned as though I were a temporary tenant in my own life. But legally nothing had changed. I stood there with the folder in my hand, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and something inside me clicked into place. They had hoped I wouldn't look. They had hoped I would keep setting the table, keep baking the scones, keep waiting quietly while they rearranged my future around themselves. But they hadn't counted on this drawer. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the documents out in front of me. My fingers traced the signatures, the dates. I reread every line, not with panic but with purpose. Then I made a list, not of revenge, not of grievances, a list of what was mine. The house, the pension account, the small investment I had quietly managed since my husband passed, the car old but running, the garden overgrown but still blooming. My life. That evening I went into the garage and found the small black file box where I had kept copies of everything. I dusted it off, carried it into the living room, and placed it beside my armchair. It felt like bringing a lantern into a dark room. I didn't know what I would do yet. Not exactly. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something close to steadiness. I hadn't been thrown away. I had been underestimated. And that, I realized, was something I could work with. The call wasn't dramatic. It came just after lunch, while I was folding towels in the quiet of the laundry room. My phone buzzed against the washing machine, the screen lighting up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Judith Lane. Once we spoke weekly. She was my husband's friend before she became mine, an estate lawyer with a dry sense of humor and a fondness for herbal lozenges. She had retired early, moved to a smaller town, and the last time we spoke, she'd just taken up birdwatching. Answered. Judith. Was. Martha. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Older. But steady. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, she said. Neither was I admitted. She laughed gently. I heard from Diane that things might not be easy right now. I didn't want to assume, but I thought if you ever needed to talk. I sat down on the edge of the laundry basket. I found the property documents, I said quietly. Good. Another pause. Then her voice shifted. Less gentle now, more exact. And do they know? No. Then you're still ahead. That was all she needed. We made plans to meet in 2 days. Quietly, over tea, in her garden where the neighbors wouldn't be listening. She told me what to bring. Original deeds, the insurance folder, the signed affidavits from 2004. I had nearly forgotten the signatures. But she hadn't. After the call, I stood in the hallway and watched the sun shift across the carpet. I had forgotten what it felt like to be understood without explanation. They had stopped seeing me clearly long ago. To them I had become a background hum. The comfort of someone always available. A door left unlocked. But Judith saw me. Saw the legal weight behind my name. Saw the way small details become armor when worn quietly and with intention. That night, I pulled out a folder and labeled it carefully, with a pen I hadn't used in years. Martha L. Gibbons, Active Files. I slid each document into its place, smoothing the pages like linen. I didn't tell my son about the meeting. I didn't tell Emily. I had no reason to. Because when people begin to erase you, the best response isn't to shout. It's to become undeniable. And with every sheet of paper I filed away that night, I was reminding myself, I am not a placeholder. I am the foundation. And I am done being quiet about it. Judith's garden hadn't changed. Even after all these years it smelled the same. Warm stone, rosemary and old rain. A place where silence felt like presence, not absence. She'd planted marigolds along the path. The kind that bloom loud and golden even when everything else is tired. I arrived just past 2. She opened the gate before I could knock. You look well, she said. I smiled faintly. I've looked worse. We sat under the arbor, her tea already steeping. Earl Grey with slices of fresh orange, her signature. The documents were between us, stacked and neat in a linen folder. I hadn't slept well the night before. But that morning, for the first time in months, I'd brushed my hair slowly and chosen clothes with care. Not to impress, just to remember who I was. Judith lifted the top page, adjusted her glasses, and began reading. We didn't speak for a while. The garden hummed around us. Bees in the lavender, wind through the dry fountain, the soft rustle of paper as she turned each page. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. They've been circling, haven't they? He nodded. Not directly. But you can feel it. Like a draft from a door someone forgot to close. She tapped the deed with her index finger. This still holds. You haven't signed anything away, not legally. They're hoping proximity equals possession. I folded my hands. They stopped asking. That's what frightened me. She nodded once. When people stop asking, they've already decided what's theirs. She spent the next hour walking me through options. Gentle at first, then firm. Freeze certain assets. Redirect mail. Reclaim digital access. Establish legal clarity before they establish narrative control. She never once said the word betrayal. She didn't need to. By the time the teapot emptied, we had a plan. Not dramatic. Not vengeful. Just precise. I left the folder with her for safekeeping. As I stood to leave, she placed a hand on mine. You're not alone in this, she said. The words caught somewhere in my chest. I didn't realize how much I had missed being seen by someone who wasn't trying to shrink me. On the drive home I took the longer route. Past the church where we married. Past the cafe where my son took his first steps between 2 chairs. I let the streets speak to me like old friends. They remembered who I was, even if my own family had chosen to forget. Back home, I unlocked the front door and stood in the silence. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust. Nothing had changed, except me. And I realized then, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was watching. And they had no idea I had begun to move quietly beneath their assumptions, steady as roots. It arrived in a pale envelope. left on my doorstep without a stamp, without a knock. Just a neat little rectangle, placed as politely as a gift and twice as poisonous. I found it the morning after the meeting with Judith. The garden was still wet from night rain. I stepped out to water the mint, and there it was, tucked beside the welcome mat, as if the words still applied. My name was written in my daughter-in-law's hand. Inside a letter, folded crisply. No greeting, just lines. We've been discussing what's best for everyone. The house is too much for you now. The maintenance, the space, the loneliness. We want to help. If you're willing to sign the included transfer forms, we'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about upkeep or taxes. You can finally rest. It ended with a sentence that still echoes in my ears. We hope you'll be reasonable. Reasonable. As if surrender were sanity. As if stepping aside were the only proof of grace. I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the second sheet. Official, notarized, already dated. They had prepared everything. All I needed to do was vanish. No mention of the holidays we spent here. No nod to the laughter echoing through these walls when my grandson was small. Not a single sentence acknowledging what it would mean to give up the last piece of my husband still anchored in earth. Just logistics. I placed the papers in the freezer, between the scones and a forgotten bag of peas. I don't know why. Perhaps because betrayal should chill before it burns. I didn't call them. I didn't reply. I spent the day trimming the hydrangeas, folding linens, vacuuming the stairs with slow care, as if touching the house gently might protect it from what they intended. By evening, I poured a glass of red wine and stood by the back window, watching the porch light blink on. And I whispered to the dark, "You will not erase me in ink." Because I remembered who laid the first brick, who signed every mortgage check, who planted the birch tree in the yard and wept under it the night the doctor said it was over. They thought the house was waiting to be claimed. But it wasn't vacant. I was still here. And I had just started to remember how to hold the pen. Judith moved quickly. Within 3 days, I had new documents in hand. Not angry ones, not theatrical. Just firm. A reaffirmation of title, a restriction on transfer, a notice of legal monitoring. All written in the same clean, quiet language that had been used to try to take my house away. I signed them with a pen my husband once gave me. A deep green fountain pen with my initials etched in gold. I had tucked it away in a drawer years ago, thinking there would be no more contracts, no more decisions that required ceremony. But there it was in my hand again, balanced and ready. I signed slowly, deliberately. This wasn't revenge. This was record-keeping. That afternoon I took a walk through the neighborhood. Not far. Just a loop past the tall oaks and the white fence with the peeling paint. I nodded at Mrs. Hampton as she watered her begonias, waved at the paperboy. Normal things. But I felt different. Not secretive. Strategic. They had sent me an envelope. I had returned a wall. Judith filed everything within hours. She emailed copies, then followed up with a call. "They'll be surprised," she said. "But not for long. Once they realize they can't sell what they don't own, they'll pivot. Expect charm next. Or guilt." Thanked her. I already knew which would come first. Sure enough, 2 days later my son appeared. He didn't knock. He used his key. The one I'd forgotten he still had. I was in the sunroom, sorting old photographs. He stepped inside like it was still his house, like nothing had shifted. "Hey, Mom." His voice was casual, like a man trying to repair a fence he pretended not to break. I didn't stand. He looked around. "Emily's worried. Said maybe the letter upset you." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "We didn't mean to be pushy. Just, it's a big place. And we thought maybe it'd be easier if you had less to worry about." I looked at him then. Really looked. Not at the boy I had raised. Not at the man he became. But at the stranger standing in a room he assumed would always welcome him. "It's already easier," I said. "Now that I've made everything official." His smile wavered. "Official?" I nodded toward the folder on the table. "You can take a copy with you." Judith thought it would save you time. He didn't touch it. Instead, he rubbed his hand along the doorframe, the same way he used to when nervous. But he didn't speak. I let the silence settle. Finally, he said, "You're serious about this?" "I am." He nodded slowly, then turned toward the kitchen, as if muscle memory alone might lead him to coffee or comfort. But he stopped himself, sensing the boundary. "I'll let Emily know," he said. "Do." And then he left, gently closing a door that didn't quite latch the same anymore. Later that evening I changed the locks. Not out of anger. Out of alignment. Because when someone stops seeing your home as yours, it's time to make it unmistakable. And that, I thought, is what dignity sounds like. The clean click of a new key in an old lock. It was Emily's turn next. She arrived the following Sunday, just before dusk, when the sky hangs low with lavender light and the house feels quietest. Her knock was soft, almost apologetic. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her silhouette through the glass. Rigid posture, hands clasped around something. Peace offering, perhaps. Opened the door. She smiled, polished and thin. "Hi, Martha. I brought muffins. Lemon poppy seed. My favorite. Her least favorite. She used to joke they tasted like soap." I stepped aside. Not welcoming. Just allowing. She moved through the front hall like it was unfamiliar, though I knew she remembered every inch. Her eyes flicked to the changed locks, the missing family photos, the new folder on the hall table labeled simply "Private." We sat in the sitting room. Porty. She didn't touch hers. "I wanted to clear the air," she began, setting the muffins on the coffee table. He nodded. "Go ahead." She blinked, surprised by my invitation. Then straightened. "We've all been tense. I think maybe things got lost in translation. We weren't trying to push you out." My silence didn't rush her. It never has. She smiled again, tighter now. "It's just, when people get older, sometimes they hold on too tightly. And it makes everyone nervous." There it was, framed in sugar. "I'm not holding on," I said calmly. "I'm choosing what's mine." She looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. "The documents, Judith. Look. It feels like you're shutting us out." "I'm not shutting anyone out," I said, and I meant it. "I'm simply refusing to leave the door open for someone who keeps trying to walk through it with a suitcase and a plan." Her mouth pressed into a soft line. "We just thought you might want to feel safe. Cared for. Then you should have asked me what that looked like." That silenced her. Outside, the wind stirred the wind chimes. An old wedding gift from a friend long past. The sound was light, dissonant, clear. Emily stood. "Well," she said, smoothing her blouse, "if you change your mind, the muffins are there." "I'll keep them," I said. "To remind me." "Of what?" "That kindness without honesty is just decoration." He paused in the doorway. No apology. Just a slight narrowing of the eyes. An accountant calculating a loss. I closed the door behind her, then turned the deadbolt slowly. Not to shut her out. To shut something down. After she left, I placed the muffins on the counter. I didn't throw them away. But I didn't eat them either. Some things are best left untouched. Especially when they arrive wrapped in sweetness, but baked in strategy. There was a stillness in the days that followed. Not peace. Not yet. Just absence. No calls. No visits. No more envelopes. The air felt different in the house. Less watched. The way it does after guests leave and you can finally sit barefoot on the sofa again. I spent most of my time in the garden. The roses were starting their second bloom. Smaller but more fragrant, as if the struggle of the first flowering had deepened their scent. I trimmed them slowly, letting the clippings fall into a rusted old pail. The sky hung heavy with late summer heat, but I didn't mind the sweat. It made me feel real. In the evenings I sewed. Old tablecloths mostly. Repurposing them into smaller things. Tea cozies, cloth napkins, a cushion for the bench by the door. My hands moved with quiet purpose, like they were building something no one else could see. I listened to classical music on the radio. Read old journals I'd forgotten I'd written. Made soup from bones and peelings and let it simmer all day, just for myself. It wasn't loneliness. It was solitude. Ozone. And in that space, things began to shift. I started organizing the attic. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see what I had forgotten. I found my wedding dress, still wrapped in a dry cleaner's sheath yellowed with time. I found my son's childhood drawings, brittle and bright with misspelled words. One showed our house with hearts over every window. I held it in my hands for a long time. Then I filed it away. Not in a box, but in the drawer where I keep the will. Not out of spite. As record. A truth layered into other truths. By the 5th day I realized something strange. I hadn't thought about whether they'd come back. I wasn't waiting anymore. And when the phone finally did ring, I let it. I watched the name glow on the screen. I counted the rings. Then I turned the volume down and walked into the kitchen, humming. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had finally remembered the sound of my own life when no one else was in the room. And it was music. The storm arrived quietly. Voicemail first. My son, his voice thin with practiced concern. "Hey Mom. We're a little confused about some paperwork that came through. Mind giving me a call?" Then an email less cordial. More urgent. Emily's tone, hidden behind his name. "There seems to be a mistake with the house records. We need to clarify a few things before finalizing some plans." Plans. I imagined them. Blueprints already drawn, listings half-written, calls made to decorators and lenders and friends. I imagined the tour. This will be the nursery. This. Oh, it used to be hers. But I had already made my own plans. Called Judith. "They've started circling," I said. "They've smelled the wall," she replied. We met the next day at her office. She wore gray silk, no jewelry. Just a small brooch I remembered from years ago. A golden sparrow. I brought the file box, the green pen, the envelope from the freezer. Everything. She skimmed the correspondence, then handed me a new set of papers. "These are the final protections. We'll register a deed reaffirmation. Post it publicly. They'll see it and know." "Will they fight?" "Yes. They might flinch," she said. "But they can't fight what's clear." I signed each line with that green pen. By afternoon, the house was no longer a shadow in someone else's plan. It was anchored. 2 days later they came. Not together, separately like strategists trying two fronts. My son arrived first. He was tired-looking, dressed too formally for a casual visit. He brought nothing. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "Tell you what?" I said gently. "That you were formalizing everything. Would it have mattered?" He didn't answer. He stood in the foyer as if waiting for something familiar to reappear. The smell of baking bread, the sound of his name spoken softly. But the house was quiet. It had aligned itself with me. "I just thought we were a team," he finally said. "We were," I replied. "Until you started drawing the map without telling me where I lived on it." He left not angrily but dimmed. Emily came the next evening. No muffins. No soft tone. "This is unnecessary," she said. "It's already done," I said. She looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I saw it. Not cruelty. Not even greed. Entitlement. The belief that something given once is hers forever. She left without another word. I watched her drive away from the upstairs window, the one that faces the roses. I stood there long after her car disappeared, hand resting on the frame. Then I whispered, more to myself than to the glass. "You thought I wouldn't notice the erasure. But I saved every draft." And in that moment the house didn't feel heavy. It felt returned. Not to the past. Me. Autumn came fast. The air turned crisp, and the light thinned in the afternoons. My porch, once cluttered with gardening gloves and watering cans, now held a single wooden chair and a small wool blanket folded neatly across the arm. I found myself sitting there more often than not. Not waiting. Just watching. Leaves fell in spirals, and with them, the last illusions I'd kept in shadow. I didn't hate them, my son, his wife. That would have required too much heat. No, what I felt was cooler, measured. I simply didn't owe them anything. That was the revelation. One morning I pulled out the family photo albums. Not out of longing but out of clarity. I began sorting them, quietly, methodically. I made 3 piles. For me. For them. For letting go. Photos I loved. The ones where I wasn't just a figure behind the cake or the camera. I kept. Photos where I was clearly an accessory to someone else's performance. I placed in the 3rd pile. The albums thinned. The air inside me cleared. Then came the call. From the realtor they'd contacted. Mrs. Gibbons. I just wanted to follow up on the potential listing your son mentioned. Has the timeline changed? I laughed. Toughly. Ainley. There is no listing, I said. And there never was. Oh. Was. Understood. I hung up and opened the back door to let the wind through the house. It moved differently now. Less like a draft, more like breath. That night I wrote a letter. Not to them. To myself. I listed every compromise I'd made in the name of peace. Every silence I'd swallowed to make others comfortable. Every part of myself I'd shrunk to fit into someone else's family frame. Then I folded the letter and placed it beneath the cushion on the porch chair. Not to hide it. To sit with it. Because some truths aren't meant to be burned. They're meant to be lived through. And from that chair, wrapped in the quiet I chose, I whispered one final vow. I will not teach them how to grieve me by disappearing before I'm gone. I will live. I will own. I will remain. And the house, mine in every sense, held the echo like a cathedral. Whole, will, and utterly mine. The first snow came early. A light dusting, barely clinging to the rooftops and garden beds, but enough to hush the world. I watched it fall from my bedroom window, wrapped in an old shawl, a cup of tea warming my palms. The street below was empty. The silence felt different now, earned. That morning I made a final list. Not of things to do. Not of people to call. Just of what mattered. 1. The deed filed final mine. 2. The chair, still on the porch, blanket folded. 3. The letter beneath it, still unread. And 4. The stillness in me that no longer required permission. I didn't host Thanksgiving that year. There was no announcement, no confrontation, just a quiet absence. The phone rang a few times. Let it. Voicemails stacked up, each one softer than the last. Hey, Mom. Just wondering if you were okay. It was. I took long walks, even in the wind. I cooked meals only for myself. I listened to the old records my husband loved. And I didn't skip the sad songs. One afternoon a letter arrived. Not from them, but from a local college. A continuing education flyer, slipped in with the junk mail. On the back, a watercolor class. Wednesdays. No experience needed. I circled it with a pen. The next week I went. The room smelled like chalk and linseed oil. Most of the others were younger. Few were older. No one asked why I was there. They just handed me a brush. The first thing I painted wasn't a rose or a landscape or a bowl of fruit. It was a chair. Wooden. Worn. A blanket folded across its arm. And beneath it, barely visible in the shadow, a folded piece of paper. When I finished, I didn't sign my name. I just wrote 2 words in the corner. I stayed. 'Cause I had. Not as a guest. Not as a burden. But as the keeper of the story. And that finally was enough.